I put Windows on this MacBook Pro 2015 to see how well it would perform in everyday usage and gaming. Turns out some of the games ran better than I expected.
So, let's start with Muck. At 800p lowest settings, we saw about 30 FPS, which is right on the border for playable for me. Although I did have a good time with it, some of the harder bosses will be even harder on a machine such as this. If you want to see what the performance is like under macOS and Linux, then you can watch these videos after this one, if you'd like to of course. But if not, Muck runs roughly the same under every OS, even though ironically Danny said himself that he hasn't optimised the game for macOS or Linux, which will be important as we look at more games. Battlefront 2 2005 next. This really exceeded my expectations. At 1600p high settings, we were seeing an almost constant 60 FPS. Funnily enough, we were more CPU limited than GPU at some points, but as long as there's not too many enemies on screen, you shouldn't see too many drops. Definitely a lot better than under Linux anyway. Flatout 2 next. Again, at 1600p, we saw a very similar result to Linux, where although we could hit 60 FPS half of the time, the other half was down to the 30s. Not completely unplayable, and definitely more so than said Linux, but disappointing nonetheless considering the age of the game. Don't slow down on the low settings at 800p, we saw above 30 FPS on average, which isn't as bad as it may seem for a game like this, but lower than I would have liked considering it's roughly 10 years old now. It seems we are actually CPU limited this time, which is an interesting change. Euro Truck Simulator 2 at 800p low settings, we saw a consistent 30 FPS. The frame rate is good considering the slower pace of the game, but much like under Linux, the low resolution makes it hard to see where you're going, especially at night. So again, not ideal, but definitely playable. Among Us next. Yes, seriously. There is a reason other than it's popular to test it. At 1600p, we were actually dipping below 60 FPS. For a visually simplistic game such as this, I was quite surprised that we couldn't consistently hit 60 FPS, but putting the settings down to 1200p pretty much solves that issue. Finally, there's Gary's mod. At 1200p on the recommended settings, we saw a nice 60 FPS average, and even regularly above 60, which was a welcome change, and again, exceeded my expectations. Still not at 1600p unfortunately, but still a nice experience nonetheless, although keep in mind, with a game like this, your experience may drastically vary depending on what mods you're using.
Bonus games!
As I was testing the game out for a laugh, I tried playing Superhot at 4K. Turns out it's kind of playable. We're getting like 15 FPS, but considering most of the game you're stationary, that's really good in my opinion. PS1 games also ran at 4K under emulation via DuckStation, which did surprise me a bit, even though it's the PS1 we're talking about. I also tried LEGO City Undercover and Forza Horizon 3 to see if more demanding games would even boot. LEGO City did get into game, then consistently crashed under a minute, and Forza wouldn't even boot, so rip I guess. And yes, Celeste and Undertale run just fine.
There's even more games that I tested off camera, but they're more of the same really, and I've done enough of that as it is. But what's Windows like for daily usage?
Well, basically everything is actually quite a bit smoother than on macOS Big Sur, ironically enough. I didn't do much on Catalina because I had to upgrade to Big Sur to use GarageBand, but Big Sur lags quite a bit even when simply web browsing. Much like Linux, YouTube playback was smooth at 1080p 60 and even doable at 1440p 60, although you will see big drops from time to time. I did try game streaming on this and it works pretty well thanks to the AC Wi-Fi, but unless you have above 50 megabits per second internet, you're not going to have a great time, and then input lag and stuttering become too much for me personally. Thanks to the surprisingly good SSD in here, the computer only takes 10 seconds or so from a cold boot to get into Windows, which is better than my main PC funnily enough, and is fascinatingly good considering its age. Finally, there's the installation. Now this isn't a tutorial in as much as a basic overview, but in typical Apple fashion, it's very easy to do. All you have to do is make a Windows 10 ISO using the Windows 10 creation tool. You may need another Windows computer for this though, and I did try using Windows 11 ISO, but that didn't work unfortunately. Open Boot Camp and follow the on-screen instructions. Then it should automatically boot into the Windows partition and follow more on-screen prompts. Then that's it. It's so nice when all of the drivers are installed for you, as opposed to backing them up yourself or hunting them down on the internet. It does make you wonder why Apple would be so helpful on their rival OS, but appreciated nonetheless.
So that's the video. Overall, I actually prefer using Windows 10 over macOS on this Mac, and I've set it as the boot priority, but I've still left macOS as a separate partition for exclusive macOS apps, like GarageBand and maybe Final Cut in the future. The gaming performance isn't as good as I would like it to be, but it can definitely game if you need to, and can even run some games at native res. The main problem is buying another Windows 10 key for the third time now. See ya.